Now the lesson on how to fix electrical problems with fridges, which is the most common problem you'll run into in fridge repair. Well, if the fan and the compressor never turn on your refrigerator, it's usually one of two problems. Since they're wired together, they should always be on together, but if you can't get them to turn on, it's very often the thermostat has gone bad, and one way is you can just punch it a little bit and see if that switches it on temporarily. Sometimes they'll come back to life for a short while. Or remove and make yourself access to the thermostat, unplug the wires to it, jump those two wires together, and then see if the fan and compressor come on. If they don't come on, well then the next problem is most likely the timer. The timer's on defrost position, which means it may have died. That means the clock motor's not turning anymore, and it may have died while it was on the defrost cycle. So it's trying to defrost itself forever, but it can't because this little thing has shut itself off because it's already warm enough in there. So it's never going to allow the compressor to turn on. Sometimes you've just moved your refrigerator to one part of the room to another part of the room, and it happened to be on defrost cycle, yet it's working fine. And you wonder why when you plug it in on another place, why it doesn't start up. If you just leave it plugged in and everything's working fine, it'll start up again within 20 minutes. Wholesale price on these timers, or defrost timers, is about $14, and the retail price is $30 to $35. It's one of the most common things that goes wrong in refrigerators. Well, if your fan's running and your compressor's not running, well then it has nothing to do with the stuff I just showed you. That's a problem with the compressor. So that can be burned out starting relay, can be a burned out overload, or it can be a bad compressor. If the compressor is really hot when you touch it and the fridge hasn't been running for a while, it's probably a bad compressor. Well, still, one of these could have failed. If you just hear it going click every few minutes, it's probably a bad compressor. If it's a capacitor model compressor, it could just be the starting capacitor. Only sometimes you can use those pins to test if a compressor's bad. You should never get a reading from any one of those pins to ground, and you should always have like 2 or 3 ohms resistance, even as low as 1 ohms, when you measure all different ways between the terminals. There should never be an open circuit between any terminals. But most of the problems with compressors aren't electrical. It's mechanical failure inside and they've seized up, or the valves have broken. When the valve's broken, they have a different sound and they get very hot on top, but almost sound like they're running normal, but they sort of have a whooshing sound to them while they're running. And when that happens, they're not putting out enough pressure, so then only a top few of these tubes will get warm and the rest will be cool. A normal functioning fridge, after it's been on for a while, all the tubes get warm and finally down by the bottom they're not warm anymore. Wholesale price on an average compressor is about $110 and over $200 retail for a regular refrigerator. Now the most common problem with fridges that's electrical, period, is the complaint that my freezer's cold but it's got ice on the back, but my fridge is warm. That could be an issue with low Freon, but here's the problems it has when it's an electrical problem. Most common problem, timer stops running, but it stops running when the fridge is on the running cycle, so the fridge just sounds like it's working normal and cycles off and on until it gets to the point where it can't cool the fridge anymore because there's such a big ice blockage on that cooling radiator back there that the fan can't blow any cool air down to the bottom, like I explained before, that comes out that hole. So the fridge may end up running all the time just trying to keep itself cool and make the freezer extremely cold, but no cold air is getting down there. Well, that's of course because your heating element isn't turning on, and that might not be turning on because it's burned out. So it's just easy to check with an ohmmeter when you take the cover off the back. So long as there isn't so much ice there you can't get access to it. To test one of these defrost termination thermostats, it actually has to be in a very cold freezer. You can't test it once it's warmed up in there because they don't reset themselves till they get between -17 to -20 Fahrenheit, which means turn themselves back on. So that's always the first thing you check when you take this cover off. And of course, if it's already cold in here, it should show almost no ohms of resistance, a perfect circuit, because the switch is closed. You can easily test that with your meter. It's not easy to test a timer with a meter because it's usually a mechanical problem. Very rarely the clock motor burns out. They usually just seize up. If they have this little window, you can see all those little holes rolling by while they're spinning. But the confusing thing is very often, just as soon as you find this thing and touch it and move it just to look at it or test it, you've shaken it enough that the little wheel starts turning again, and you may think that the fridge is, or the timer is good. So my very first test I do on a fridge that I assume has a defrosting problem is, I find the timer, I don't pay attention to whether it started running or not, and I just rotate this dial with a flat screwdriver till it goes click and it shuts the compressor off, and that puts the defrosting cycle on. Then I unplug it from its plastic connector, and then I plug it back in and out a few times, and look for a big spark on one of these terminals. You'll see a big blue spark. If you don't see a big blue spark, that means either the heating coil has burned out or this has burned out. If you do see a big blue spark, well, then that means the timer's not functioning, and it's probably just not working some days or completely not turning around ever. So just replace the timer. Just plugs in. It's that simple. You will also see a tiny blue spark, and that's happening because it's energizing the little motor, but that's just a minor blue spark. Don't pay attention to that one. These heaters have a resistance of anywhere from, say, 10 ohms to 40 ohms, and side-by-side fridges that have the freezer over there often have two shorter ones, each one about 8 inches apart. So one may be good, but the second one may be bad because they're wired in series. If you have the heater tube that looks like the black one from a stove element, those ones most rarely burn out, hardly ever. When replacing these defrost termination thermostats, it's kind of important to try to get the new one close to the larger number. The smaller number doesn't really matter. You can't tell when these are burned out by looking at them. Only the meter can tell you. Sometimes you can tell when the glass tube ones are burned out. You'll see actually the little coil inside snapped, or even burned off on the ends, and lots of different colors in there. Next problem is trying to find the timer. They're on different places on all kinds of fridges. On this particular fridge, like I mentioned earlier, it's in that little cover behind the light bulb. Some fridges have a plastic cover back there where there's some more thermostats, and that's where it is. Some fridges have a kick plate at the bottom that you can take off, and the timer's in there. The timer is never in the freezer. Some have a little metal box on the back of the fridge, and the timer's in there. Old General Electric fridges have a great big black metal cover right there, and you have to move back this coil by undoing the screws, take off about 20 or 25 screws in that black metal plate, and then the timer's buried in there behind some insulation. That one's the worst pain. Some have them here at the back of the fridge, just around this corner a little bit. There's a little hole where you can turn them to switch them off and on. Could be on either side. Some have a little tin metal box sort of mounted right there on the back of the fridge wall, and they're inside that metal box. Some have them in another little compartment back here just above the compressor. They're such a pain in the butt sometimes to find if you're not experienced with fridges. There's another kind of fridge timer. There's another kind of fridge timer called the adaptive defrost control. Well, it's a piece of crap. This is what it looks like. They come on high-end Maytag fridges and some other high-end expensive fridges. There's just a little circuit board that does the job of what should be done mechanically with the old-fashioned type of timer. These things break down all the time. They have nothing to rotate or to bypass to make them switch to defrost cycle or compressor cycle. So if you have one of those fridges, they're often even in the side-by-side fridges, they're hard to find. They would be on the upper part of the fridge inside the refrigerator, inside of a great big plastic cover where there's big wheels and air doors and lights and controls way at the back, completely out of sight. Even when you remove the cover, you can hardly see it. These pieces of junk are really expensive too. Retail about $60, wholesale about $60, and retail is a lot more. So if you have one of those Maytag kind of fridges or others that has one of those things, you've tested both these parts and they're good, well, just find this thing and that's the problem. After you're done fixing your defrost problem, unfortunately the fridge isn't going to work right away if it's still got all that ice back there. When these have a defrost problem, that whole area is a brick of ice. Well, sure, the cycle will keep turning on 20 minutes every 12 hours after you leave and let your fridge do its thing, but that's not long enough for that little heating element to melt that much ice in that short of time, so it'll never get better. So you always have to leave the fridge turned off for a minimum of 12 hours with the freezer door open to melt that ice before it'll function properly. If you have the kind of fridge that the cooling coil is in here,